Hi everyone, I'm going to continue reading I Am Lavina Cumming. So before spring break, where we left off is the 1906 earthquake had just hit. So I'm going to read chapter 19 and 20 today. Chapter 19 is Aftershocks. Okay, here we go. Little tremors or aftershocks continued to rattle Santa Cruz throughout that whole long day. At first, as the sun rose over the town, Lavina and her family huddled together for warmth, still too stunned to do anything more. They could see their neighbors camped on every lawn nearby. Then Lavina noticed that Bridget's clothes were streaked with blood. "Are you hurt?" she cried. "Not much." Aunt Agnes peered short-sightedly at the cut in Bridget's right hand. "We must attend to this," she said. "Oh, I'm freezing," murmured Cousin Maud, who was dressed in a thin, lacy nightgown. The wind must be blowing straight through it, Lavina thought, and she looked down at herself. "Aunt Agnes," she said, "I'm the only one with shoes, and the house hasn't fallen down yet. What if I went back in and got more blankets?" Her aunt hesitated. "I don't want to send you into danger, child." Lavina handed her coat to Cousin Maud. "I'll run fast," she promised. "Very well, then." Lavina raced inside and brought out an armload of bedding, and Aunt Agnes tore strips from a pillowcase to bandage Bridget's hand. "See," Lavina told Aggie, "with this extra sheet we can make ourselves a tent under the plum tree. That's fun." "I'm hungry." The small, listless voice was quite unlike Aggie's usual whine. As time passed, the house did not collapse. Lavina made bolder raids inside. She rescued Signor Caruso, who sat in a feathery huff on the bottom of his cage. Then she went to explore the kitchen and returned with a basket of food. "I smell gas," she reported. "The pipe may have broken," said Cousin Maud. "Saints above," cried Bridget. "We'll all be blown to glory." And suddenly they all smelled smoke. Clouds of it curled above the trees on the other side of Santa Cruz, and shouts rang through the neighborhood. "Fire! Fire!" Now a few horses and buggies were moving up and down Vine Street, and neighbors in nightclothes came to call. "We heard the city is ruined," someone said. "Yes, San Francisco is burning," someone else added. Oh, Lavina clapped her hands to her mouth. "Susan and Bertie!" "I wonder how the Moberlys are," said Cousin Maud. Aunt Agnes said steadily, "My dears, we must shut off the gas valve at the street this minute." From her chair, where she sat regally wrapped in her blanket, the old lady surveyed her rattle-taggle household. "We look like a band of gypsies," Aunt Agnes chuckled. Over her nightgown, Cousin Maud wore one of Bridget's shawls and a kitchen apron. Bridget wore her own best coat, a stylish feathered hat, and bandages. Lavina, wrapped in another of Bridget's shawls, and Aggie, with her frightful hair, wore Lavina's coat. "Lavina," Aunt Agnes went on, "now that the gas leak seems to have stopped, will you please try to find—" Aunt Agnes ticked the items off of her fingers. "My spectacles and a clean handkerchief, and if you can happen across it, my sewing basket. Oh, and a comb." After spending some time searching, Lavina finally carried the items out to her aunt. One spectacle lens was slightly cracked, but Aunt Agnes wiped them with a handkerchief and placed them on her nose with a sigh of relief. She opened the sewing basket and selected a pair of scissors. "Now," she said, "Aggie, come here." Cousin Maud and Aggie both winced, but Aggie obeyed her grandmother without saying a word. Snip! A long lock of hopeless hair fell to the ground. Click! Another one followed. And in a very short time, Aggie was shorn. "She looks just like a chick just sprouting pin feathers," Lavina thought. Aggie put her own hand wonderingly up to her head and touched the short blonde tufts that remained. "Much better," said her grandmother. "No more ringlets," mourned her mother. "No more ringlets," repeated Aggie in a faraway tone. Then she just smiled. "No more combing." "It feels so light," she said next. She gave a little skip. She turned to Lavina and smiled again. "Thank you," she said. Lavina sat down, bump on the grass, in utter amazement. Aunt Agnes said, "Lavina, I owe you an apology." Lavina shook her head until her pigtails batted her shoulders. It was wrong of me to keep the necklace without telling you, but I don't know how to explain. I felt homesick and poor and bad." Aunt Agnes removed her spectacles and polished them again. "We won't say another word about it, child. All's well that ends well. Now, Bridget," said Aunt Agnes crisply, "you have been a true heroine today, you and Lavina both. I'm a cross old woman. I hope that you will both forgive what I said last night and stay with us." "Yes, please stay," said Cousin Maud. "Please," said Aggie. A wonderful warmth glowed in Lavina's heart. She felt as she had felt at the end of her journey to California when Aunt Agnes first opened her door and welcomed Lavina inside. "Well, ma'am," began Bridget. A grin broke out all over her face and she raised her bandaged hand. "I can't exactly cook for you right now." "I can," said Lavina, jumping up. "No, dear, it's not safe," said her aunt. "We'll build a campfire," said Lavina. "I know all about it. We do it on roundups and when we go hunting. Let's have bacon and eggs. That's easy. And I can even bake biscuits in a Dutch oven or gingerbread." "I like gingerbread," said Aggie in her new small voice. Lavina made a circle of bricks from the fallen chimney and sent Aggie to collect tinder and twigs for a fire. "Father taught me how to build a one-match fire when I was little," she said. First she stood the smallest twigs in a pyramid over a few dry leaves and bits of paper, and then she built several gradually larger pyramids over the first one. There! The match flared, the fire blazed, the bacon sizzled in the pan. Lavina boiled water for tea. Aggie brought firewood. She watched intently as Lavina mixed flour, ginger, butter, molasses, eggs, and hot water, then filled the hot Dutch oven with gingerbread batter, set the iron lid in place, and buried the Dutch oven in the coals. "When is it done?" "When it smells done," said Lavina. "Not for a while. We'll eat it for supper." She settled down by the fire with a sigh of contentment. "See, Aggie? When you don't have chairs, you squat. Try it. It works just fine." "Every fire is different," she thought, staring into the flames, "yet all fires are the same." She saw an Arizona campfire. Soon the day's work would be done, and her brothers would gather around, and after they had eaten their beans and tortillas and meat, they would all listen quietly in the smoky firelight. "And what kind of story do you want?" "A true story, Father." Suddenly Lavina heard a rude honk of an automobile horn. "Frank!" cried Cousin Maud, and she dashed to the curb. We're going to continue. Chapter 20, Gingerbread. The Oldsmobile chugged up the hill with Freddie waving from the passenger seat. Mr. Moberly was as sooty as a chimney sweep. "I've been fighting fires," he called as they drew closer. 12 buildings completely gone in Santa Cruz, they say, but that's nothing compared to the city." "Oh, Bertie and Susan," thought Lavina. When Mr. Moberly stepped from the car, Cousin Maud threw her arms around him. "I've been awfully worried, Frank." "You worried? About me? Really?" said Mr. Moberly. "Of course, and Freddie too. How are you, dear?" Freddie was staring at Aggie. "What happened to her?" he said. "Nothing to do with the earthquake," sniffed Aggie. She tossed her head, but nothing in particular happened. "Well," thought Lavina, "at least she can't pull her hair anymore and shout ding-dong." "Can you stay to dinner?" asked Cousin Maud. "We'd be ever so delighted." Mr. Moberly accepted. Is there enough bacon?" whispered Lavina to Bridget. "There's plenty of eggs," said Bridget. "I'm sure I don't know why they didn't break in the earthquake." "Look, look!" shouted Freddie and Aggie, jumping up and down and pointing. The bedraggled group of refugees had appeared at the bottom of Vine Street Hill. There were 2 men in nightshirts tucked into their trousers, 1 woman in a nightgown, a string of pearls, and a man's coat, and another woman elegantly dressed in an evening gown and an opera cloak with tattered bedroom slippers on her feet. A tall, thin girl wore pajamas and a woman's fur stole. A short, chubby girl wore what seemed to be 2 nightgowns and a checked tablecloth. They grinned through the grime on their faces. Lavina started to run. "Susan! Bertie! Yoo-hoo!" The Pittses and the Lees sank down on Aunt Agnes's lawn and all spoke at once. "In the beginning we're all thrown out of bed," said Susan's father. "We were too," said Freddie. My bed took me for a ride, said Lavina. And the hotel was in panic. Luckily ours and the shock pretty well. Some of those skyscrapers collapsed immediately. I tell you, San Francisco will never be the same again. The Grand Opera House is gone, said Mrs. Pitt sadly, and churches, mansions, boarding houses, everything. Soldiers are dynamiting buildings to stop the fire, but it's burning out of control. No. Mr. Lee shook his head. We were very lucky, among the first to escape from the city. But first we had to walk through the ruins, said Susan. Oh, it was terrible, said Bertie. Such awful sight, said her mother. She covered her face briefly with her hands as though she were praying. Many voices spoke at once. There was a man walking down Market Street with an empty birdcage in his hand. There were mothers who had lost their children and children without mothers. I saw a little dressmaker pushing her sewing machine along the rubble. It was all she had. There were robbers. There were soldiers with bayonets, firemen, heroes, people drinking champagne, people thirsty. Boom, boom, boom from the dynamite all the time. The water mains are broken, so they can't fight the fires very well. The telegraph lines are down and the trains aren't running. San Francisco is entirely cut off from the rest of the world. Food is already scarce. The buildings lean every which way. The streets are so full of wreckage that it's like walking over the roughest mountains. The chorus of voices fell silent for a moment. Oh, my poor feet, said Mrs. Lee. How did you ever get out? Asked Mr. Moberly. We decided to leave immediately, and by water instead of train, said Mr. Pitts. We gathered some clothes, as you see, and made our way to the ferry building. Oh, Lavina, breathed Susan. We walked through Chinatown where all the buildings had fallen down, and underneath the streets were tunnels so strange. Opium dens, said her father shortly. Lavina imagined the strange fumes rising from cracks in the earth, Chinese altars, children with long pigtails. Papa bought food at a little restaurant early in the morning, Bertie said. All they had to sell was apple pie and ginger beer, so that's what we lived on all day long, laughed Mr. Lee. We squeezed into a ferry boat, crossed the bay to Oakland, and finally took a train the long way round, and here we are. We telephoned our houses from the station, said Mrs. Pitts. By some miracle, the lines are working, and everyone is all right there. Thank God, said Aunt Agnes. Now dusk was falling, and they drew closer to the fire. A few stars pricked through the sky, almost the first stars Lavina had noticed since she came to California. We'll camp out tonight, said Lavina to her friends. I'll show you how to make a warm bedroll, and maybe we can sleep in the fort under the plum tree. Can I come too? Asked Freddie. Why not? She said. She glanced at Aggie, but Aggie leaned against Cousin Maud and said nothing. Tomorrow, said Mr. Lee, the work begins. Everyone has losses. Aunt Agnes looked grave. Tomorrow we'll start to clean up the mess, said Susan's mother with a sigh. And we'll telegraph Lavina's father to say she's safe. But there's something you haven't told us, said Mr. Moberly. What's that? How was the opera? Oh, the adults broke into laughter. Fine, just fine. It seems so long ago. And the great Caruso? Said Cousin Maud. Well, said Mrs. Pitts, the last I saw of him was early this morning. He was in his shirt sleeves, sitting on top of a heap of trunks in a freight wagon. He looked like a lost soul. He's awfully fat, Susan whispered to Lavina. He sang beautifully anyhow, and he will again, said Mrs. Pitts warmly. But not here. The opera season is over, I think, said Mr. Moberly. Everybody laughed. Then Lavina sniffed. The gingerbread, she said. It's done. She dug the Dutch oven out of the coals, and when she lifted off the ashy iron lid, a delicious fragrance escaped into the air, like one of the pent-up genies in the Arabian Nights. Lavina cut into it 13 equal pieces, and they all ate gingerbread together, down to the last crumb, sitting around the friendly campfire on the evening of the great San Francisco earthquake. Wow, pretty incredible. If you have time, you guys should Google San Francisco earthquake. Make sure you Google 1906, and there are some photographs on there that are pretty amazing, where you can actually see the buildings that were basically down to nothing. And there's some other photographs where you can see actually cracks in the earth. I'll see if I can dig some up and email those over to you guys. And then we only have 2 chapters left, and then we'll start our new book, okay? So thanks, guys.